Good afternoon. I am Lourdes Ramirez Wright, and I am back to speak with you a little bit on CPTSD. And this weather here in McHenry, Mississippi is absolutely amazing. I am really loving it. I am in my backyard and I am enjoying the day. I had a great workout this morning. And one thing I wanted to discuss today, because I think it's so important, is that whenever you look for information on complex PTSD online or whatnot, even in books or on TV, what have you, you're typically going to be sent to something regarding PTSD, but not complex. In addition to that, one common theme that I am noticing amongst those who discuss complex PTSD is that they say to you, well, we have to give you the tools to navigate through those relationships with narcissists who caused the damage, the CPTSD. I am afraid that I am in disagreement with those who say that. And that is because I think we need to give people the tools to leave those relationships, not to stay in them, but to leave. And the argument goes, well, a lot of times, like for instance, a mother, without the resources because she has been caring for the children she had with this narcissist person, she doesn't have the resources now. Where is she going to go if she leaves? But is that a solution to the problem? By her staying or he staying in a bad situation that is abusive and that is causing her trauma or causing him trauma, she or he is exposing himself or herself to that continuous abuse. And I think that is a huge mistake. So I really wish that more people out there who discuss complex PTSD and narcissism gave the sufferers of such condition the tools to leave those bad relationships. That's my personal humble opinion. And the reason I am putting together narcissism with CPTSD is because I am going to assume that if you are watching this video because you have CPTSD, I am going to assume that you were abused and neglected. And notice that I am using the word and instead of or. I've also heard these experts saying neglect or abuse. I don't think that one can coexist without the other. If you were abused as a child, you were neglected. If you were neglected as a child, you were abused. To me, the two go together. Having said this, these are the people who caused the damage being complex PTSD. So I am going to assume that you were abused and neglected, and I am going to assume that it was by your parents or your caregivers. It could have been another trauma. You could have seen or witnessed something. You could have been a part of some catastrophic event as a child. Not likely. Typically, CPTSD refers to childhood abuse and neglect. And typically, the people who cause the damage, whether it be caregivers, guardians, biological parents, adoptive parents, whatever. Typically, they abuse because they are narcissists. And there are different types of narcissists, right? We have the martyr, martyr, the martyr, the one who likes to lament over everything, and she is the victim, and she cries and cries and complains. She's always the victim. And that is called the vulnerable narcissist. And then you have the delusional narcissist and the grandiose narcissist. This is a person who builds herself or himself in her or his own mind. The person is delusional and the person is abusive. And there are other types of narcissists. So I think that by now we are very clear as to what a narcissist is, how to identify them, how to even avoid them. However, what you do not find much on is precisely now what? Now that I've been diagnosed with CPTSD, now that I have childhood trauma, and it has been diagnosed professionally by someone who has a little diploma on her wall, what now? What do I do? Well, one thing you definitely want to do is get out of your system whatever you need to get out of your system so that you can get up and go. Do not expect anyone to come rescue you, because it's not going to happen. That's never going to happen. You have to rescue yourself. You can have an amazing, unbelievably good life, but it's all going to be up to you. If you are putting it out there that you have CPTSD, or you are talking with people about it, or you are doing all sorts of things for sympathy and to have people feel sorry for you, then maybe there are other things on which you could be working, because there's definitely something going on there that is not good or healthy. A healthy person never ever wants others to feel sorry for her. So if you're doing it because it is therapeutic and because you finally get to speak out, you're free to speak out, or for other legit reasons, that's wonderful. It's amazing. It's something that everybody with CPTSD should do, I think. But if you're doing it to gain sympathy or special favors, or to get people to feel sorry for you, that's the wrong thing to do. So, what now? You've been diagnosed with CPTSD. What do you do now? As soon as you get out of your system what you need to get out of your system, you need to get up and go and do exactly what you have to do. Do not isolate yourself. It's okay to spend time alone. Once you have been diagnosed with this condition, you're going to find that you are going to read a lot about the symptoms, and you're going to find, if not all, most of those symptoms in you. So you're doing research and you're getting to know, okay, how do I improve this? How do I deal with this? What is this called? Why is this happening? You're going through a transition. You're doing a lot of research, you're reading a lot of books, you might even be talking to somebody at church, you might be looking for that spiritual guidance, and that's all wonderful for you to do your own research. At the same time, at some point, you are going to have to deal with reality. And the reality can be extremely painful to some, and that has to do with who you are, your personal experience. It can be so painful that the thought would not even enter the mind of those who are going to be contemplating the ideas. For instance, you might come to the realization that maybe one parent or both of your parents, whoever abused you or whoever turned a blind eye, did not really feel love and affection and affinity for you as a child. And that seems pretty incredible, doesn't it? Because we have been conditioned as a society to think and to believe that every parent adores his or her child. That's the ideal, isn't it? And we want to put these mothers and fathers on pedestals. We don't want to question ever their actions or their words, because it's almost as if we as a society have to take for granted that if they are our parents, they love us, they wanted us, and they feel affection for us. It is very unfortunate, however, that that is not always the case. And that is not the case for a lot of individuals who are now adults suffering with complex PTSD because of childhood trauma. This is one realization that I believe the faster you accept, maybe the faster you will be able to move away from a dark place. At first, you're analyzing everything and you're saying to yourself, well, this doesn't make any sense. What my therapist told me makes no sense. What I am reading in my research makes no sense. My parents have to love me. They must have loved me. They must have wanted to have had a child. They must have wanted me to be born. They must have liked me. The truth of the matter is that some people, some adults have babies for many, many reasons. Unfortunately, they are not always noble, legit reasons. Sometimes it has to do with old school. Back in the old days, we didn't have the information and the prevention methods that we have today. So I think that to put a blanket on every parent out there, just for having done what came natural, which is to actually give birth, which women are biologically made to do, is an overreach. It's really covering everybody, and that is not an accurate picture. So that is one realization with which you might be struggling right now. Another realization is that maybe you're finding yourself in a place that is not as ahead as your classmates or your childhood friends, etc. And all I ask you to do is to analyze that thought. It makes absolutely no sense, and you are being unfair to yourself for something that happened to you. You were not responsible for anything that happened to you when you were 5, 6, 7 years old, okay? So you have to cut yourself some slack. What you should not be doing, in my opinion, is throwing the blame when you are older, and that's why you did not achieve A, B, C, or D. At some point, you have to take responsibility for your own life. And typically that happens when you are an adult. And different states consider adulthood to be a certain age. Why? We're not going to go there, are we? Because that would be a little bit political. So this video is not about politics. But depending on the state in which you live, the age of consent or the age of maturity or adulthood is either 18 or 21 or what have you. So we're not going to worry about that. But whatever adulthood is in your space, that's when we're supposed to take responsibility for our own lives. So for instance, I developed CPTSD, but at some point, after curling up and maybe crying my eyes out and finding some solitude, I had to get up and I had to go, because nobody is going to come and rescue me. And I know this, okay? The thing is that sometimes the attachment for some can be dangerously too tight with the abuser. For instance, let's say that you were abused by your parents. And let's say that now, 40, 50 years later, you're around them very often, but you're beginning to notice what experts tell you all the time. Abusive personalities, narcissist-abusive personalities do not change. Might you find an exception, 1 in a million? I'm sure, yes. But typically, that is not the norm. Typically, these people do not change. And that's another realization with which you might be struggling. You might have developed this bond or this traumatic, it's almost like a trauma bond with the very people who did the damage. And you're either putting on blinders or you are attempting to justify or to explain their behavior, or maybe you're even trying to talk yourself out of seeing what is really there. What is really happening. You're actually trying to talk yourself out of seeing that, because this cannot be happening not 40, 50 years later. Unfortunately, that is exactly what happens, because abusive personalities, especially narcissists, they do not change. I will give you an example. I will share a very personal and painful anecdote with you. About 2 years ago, I took my father to see a medical doctor, and the doctor asked my father to draw a clock, okay? The doctor said something like, make it, I don't know, 9:15 p.m. or whatever. And my father, unfortunately, and I knew this ahead of time, he was unable to draw a clock. I mean, what he drew on the paper did not in any way, shape, or form resemble a clock, if you get my picture. And we sort of knew this because he wasn't tying ideas any longer. He was getting lost in conversations. He was shuffling. He was holding on to the walls because he couldn't keep his equilibrium anymore. He was having a lot of falls. He was getting confused, etc. So we sort of expected that. So the doctor said, you know, there's this medication here that some patients have really noticed a change for the better. Now, some patients, however, have had a very bad experience with it because it is very strong. It is an extremely strong, excuse me? It is a very strong medication, and because of that, you want to keep a very close eye on your father, okay? And if you notice any vomiting, any stomach distress, any change, severe change, or something that doesn't seem right, just discontinue immediately and bring him in to see a doctor or call 911. But keep a very close eye on your father. So I brought my mother, I brought that medication, and I explained to her the very same thing that I just explained to you, my audience, okay? I gave her the details. I said, keep an eye on him. If anything happens, discontinue. If you notice stomach distress, vomiting was a big thing. And I went through everything with her. I also said, here are the instructions. I gave her the container and I left it with her. I said, this is how you administer it. So, that night I get a text from her and she is all excited. Oh my gosh, I have only given your father one dosage and he really has shown improvement. He is talking and laughing and in great spirits and he seems to be doing great. I haven't seen him like this in years. And I said, wow, just continue to give it to him. Just make sure he doesn't miss one dosage. And so she was supposed to administer one more dosage, maybe like 1 hour after we were having this exchange, this conversation. And she told me, and I said, give it to him. Just make sure that you give it to him. Even now, I'm sure that 1 hour will not make much of a difference. And then I remember myself sort of backpedaling, like, well, maybe that's not such a good idea, right? So I said, just make sure you read the container and but make sure he doesn't miss that next dosage because obviously it's working out great for him. And there was no evidence of stomach distress, of nausea, or what have you. So the next morning, this is the next morning now. Mind you that before leaving, I said to my mom, make sure that if anything happens or you notice anything, call me because I am always up at 4 in the morning. I'm an early bird. I'm always up very early. And I don't mind your calling with something like that. I'm going to have my phone with me. And I remember having slept with my phone on just in case. Because, the medication was new, etc. So, also, I live only 30 minutes away from them. I have a sister who lives locally, but she lives an hour away. 1 full hour away. So, I left, and the next morning, I get a phone call from my brother-in-law. My brother-in-law, my sister, his wife, is at my parents' home that morning. So I thought, wow, that's strange. What gives? So he tells me, your father got up basically violently ill. Since he got up, he's been vomiting. Hasn't stopped pretty much since he got up. And I would assume that my father got up that morning with my mom maybe, I don't know, maybe at 4 or 5 in the morning. I don't know how early really, but quite early. I would have been up and I was only 30 minutes away. But at any rate, so I said, did anybody call 911? He pauses and he says, no. I said, I'll be right over. So I got dressed real fast. I drove half hour. When I get there, the atmosphere in my parents' home is very, very hostile. There were 4 people all together in the home. My father, he was bent over the bathroom sink, throwing up. My sister was there. my mom was there, who lives with my dad, and my sister's husband was there. He's the one who called me. So I come in, my brother-in-law, is sitting on the sofa in the living room. My mother and my sister are leaning forward, just very, very engaged. So engaged that there was no "Good morning, how are you, Lourdes? Thank you for coming. Would you like some coffee? How are you? Thank you for driving." Nothing. There was no acknowledgement whatsoever. They were very, very engaged. I couldn't, from the front door, and as I walked through the house, I couldn't quite hear. But when I went past them, all I could hear was my mother repeating the same thing in a loop, over and over again. She told me to give him the medication. She told me. That's all I could hear. But I wanted to see my father right away because I wanted to tend to his situation. I didn't know what was going on. As soon as I entered the bathroom, I see him at the sink and he is just throwing up. So he's standing there. And at this point, I begin to ask for a chair loudly. At this point, I am with my father. I don't want to leave him because he seems weak. Obviously, he had been throwing up for some time in the morning and he was still throwing up, so he was probably getting very dehydrated. And so I didn't want to leave him. So I was basically screaming for a chair. I need a chair. We need a chair. And my mother and my sister were so engaged. And my mother seemed very agitated and very angry. My sister was not saying one word. She was doing the listening. They were so engaged that at no time was there any kind of recognition or acknowledgement. So finally, after my having asked so many times for a chair to place underneath my dad so that he wouldn't fall on the floor just in case, I decided to leave him alone for a few seconds and come out and get the chair myself. As soon as I did that, my mother, she was very agitated. She looked the other way and they were quiet. They were quiet at the time, and I looked at my brother-in-law and he was sitting at the sofa looking over his shoulder at everything that was happening. So nobody got me the chair. I grabbed the chair right there. I went back into the bathroom and I placed it underneath my dad, and he was able to sit down. And as soon as he felt another bout of nausea, he would get up and bend over the sink. So as soon as I saw that, I went ahead, got the phone, and I called 911 immediately. I called the ambulance. So this was the scenario. When I went to help my father. It seems as if my mother was blaming me for my father's sickness. What she failed to see was that the doctor himself warned against the possible severe side effects of the medication, especially the vomit. He did say some patients respond horribly to this medication and they have to discontinue because of the vomiting, the stomach distress, etc. So if you notice anything. So I left those instructions with my mother, and if she was so concerned about my having asked her to administer the medication 1 hour before it was due, she really didn't have to do anything that I said to her on the phone because, number one, I am not an MD, I'm not a medical doctor. But number two, she's an adult. She is an adult in her 80s, in fact. So if she did not wish to administer the medication, all she had to do was, again, read the container, and the container would have told her to wait that 1 hour, because you're supposed to get your medication every so often. So if it troubled her that much, she really didn't have to give him the med prematurely, right? She could have waited until it was due. But she is basically blaming me for the entire episode because she told me. She was saying to my sister, she told me to give him the medicine early. And I felt this feeling of betrayal that I had experienced so many times growing up. When I was a child, it was a constant triangulation. So she was basically bringing in a third party and a fourth party because my sister's husband also came. So she brought in other parties into the equation when all she had to do was call me. As soon as my father got up sick, she could have called me. And I would have driven there immediately, or I would have called the ambulance for her. But instead, she called my sister, who lives 1 hour away. And she was obviously on the phone with my sister laying the ground, right? She needed an ally. And this is what professionals out there call scapegoating and enabling. My sister was doing the enabling, and my mother was scapegoating me. But this was nothing new. I had seen this throughout my entire childhood, okay? That was not bad enough. When I left, I followed the ambulance, and everybody stayed at the house. Nobody came to the hospital. Nobody, except for me and my husband. By the time that I got there, some medical personnel were asking where this man's family was, because he was by himself in the room. It took me a little bit longer than the ambulance to get there. Then en route, I called my husband and I asked him to meet me at the hospital, which he did. So in the hospital with my father, there were 2 people, myself and my husband. But that was not enough. Same week, I sat in the passenger side, in the back side of my mother's SUV because she was new in town and she didn't know how to get somewhere. So I was sort of like her GPS. And this is after the episode. My dad was fine by then. So she keeps blaming it on me. She says, I know what happened that day. I know what happened, and God saw what happened. And this is days after, okay? She was still convinced that the entire episode was my fault. And this is called scapegoating. But it was nothing new. She's now in her 80s, and this is not going to change. It was very painful because when I took my father to the doctor, I was trying to help. When I brought the medication, I was trying to help. When I came to the house that morning, I was trying to help. When I followed the ambulance to the hospital and took moving of my dad, being okay, thumbs up, and talking so that I could send it to my siblings and my mom, I was trying to help. So in my heart, I was doing nothing but helping. Instead, my mother was triangulating me. My sister was scapegoating me with my mother because she was enabling my mother. And when you enable the person who's doing the scapegoating, you're also scapegoating the target. Okay? So this is only one example of probably hundreds that I have in my new book. It is called Cone of Silence. And if you go through Amazon, you will find 6 or 7 books that I have out there. The latest is Cone of Silence, and you will see how my CPTSD developed, how I acquired one of the most debilitating conditions that any human being can develop. And here I am in the year 2023. I am extremely healthy. I'm strong. I am happy. And I did it all by myself. No alcohol, no medication, no drugs. I did it by myself. So if you pick up my book, Cone of Silence, and you look for me, Lourdes Wright, you're going to find a history of how CPTSD develops and intergenerational dysfunction, toxicity, and narcissistic abuse. I do think that it's very informative, and hopefully it will inspire many of you out there who find yourselves without answers, without solutions. The whole thing makes no sense. And the realizations that you're going to have to deal with are very tough. But the sooner you do that, the sooner you can move on. Okay? The name of the book again is Cone of Silence. If you have Kindle Unlimited, it's free. So thank you for joining me this week. I am looking forward to seeing you next week. I try to put out a video every single Sunday. Remember, above all, the world is a better place because you are in it.